Some years ago, I was sitting with two teachers and their teenage son when he announced to his parents and to me that he had concluded that he is the illegitimate son of Adolf Hitler. And of course, the parents and I are thinking, where on earth did that come from? So I thought, that's just a lead-in. I thought, where on earth did that come from? But I thought I would take this time to try to make some sense of the symptoms of schizophrenia, try to make some of them understandable. Because of course, am I hearing things? That which we don't understand, we are afraid of. That which we do understand, we tend to not be afraid of. And especially when it comes to human behavior. If we don't have a way of understanding it, we are afraid of it and we think it's crazy. In fact, it's the actual, we apply two kinds of things. Is there a logical sequence with a beginning and a consequence that will explain this behavior? That man climbed the tree because he was chased by a bear. That man climbed the tree because he was chased by a bee. Doesn't fully make sense, so we start to wonder about the man. So in this area, we have people who, of course, behave in very inexplicable, puzzling, and sometimes dangerous ways, but often dangerous to themselves and to their position in our social world. So let me try to give you an explanation for some of the symptoms of schizophrenia. To do this, unfortunately, means I have to link three areas of knowledge about the human brain and about ourselves as social animals. And so this is very abstract stuff, but perhaps afterwards we can, with questions, bring it more down to a practical and specific level. The first of these concepts, and the importance of this idea and concept and reality, is variously referred to as, by the linguists, pragmatics of communication, by the social workers, non-verbal communication, psychologists, contextual information processing, and I often use the term pretextual communication because the term pretextual acknowledges that this non-textual communication begins before actual language development. And it continues around and through language development, through childhood and through adulthood. In fact, this particular contextual information processing is one of the few brain skills that can gradually improve throughout the entire lifespan. So presumably I'm getting better at it, although my mathematics is gone. So the good side is that this particular skill or ability that we humans have and our chimpanzee relatives have as well can improve gradually through life. And then even in adulthood, so we're talking about contextual information processing, pragmatics, and even in adulthood, in any interpersonal exchange, the pretextual, contextual information component of the exchange can carry 50 to 90% of the meaning. It can actually carry pretty close to 100% of the meaning in any exchange. The linguists talk about the one communication in which you don't need to look at the pragmatics, the contextual information. I hope I don't get too abstract here. The contextual information is, there is a fire in the building, everybody please get up and leave. It's one of the few sentences where you don't have to wonder who's saying that, who is he, what role is he in, what was his tone of voice. You just need the text. There is a fire in the building, please leave the building. It's actually one of the few sentences you can think of in which you don't need anything more than the text before you then behave in an appropriate way, follow through. When you run into an acquaintance and say hello, there's very little information conveyed in the text, hello, H-E-L-L-O. All the meaningful information in that exchange can be found in the surrounding elements, the contextual information or pretextual information, and that includes the voice, the tonality, the pitch, the emphasis, the prosody of the voice, the facial expression, posture, eyes, especially the eyes, and the broader context. In order to understand that hello, I'm just picturing as a human being, an adult, somebody greets you hello. To understand that, be comfortable with it, you have to be able to read all the contextual information and process it and respond accordingly. Is this the greeting of long lost lovers? Or of wary strangers simply acknowledging they are of the same species passing in the night? Hello can be either, right? So that's the first concept. Hang on to that one. Contextual information processing. A very important part of all cognition. The second requires accepting that our brains, the second concept, that our brains are fundamentally organizing machines. I mean, that's why I'm writing all this, trying to organize and figure out how to make sense of something. Our brains take in, I wrote down terabytes, but I don't know what goes above terabytes, but I'm sure it's way above terabytes of information, and we filter out most of it. And what we do is look for patterns in the rest. We don't see chairs, really, as they are. We glimpse the outline and we know it's a chair because of its function, and it fits a certain pattern in our lives, and we understand its function. So we look for patterns. Patterns that will help us navigate this social world and especially give us a pretty good idea of what is likely to happen next. Now, you can picture how through evolution this would make perfect sense of where we are, but our brains organize, filter out much of what we experience internally, auditory, visual, especially visual, tactile, memories. We filter it out and we look for patterns that will help us understand what is happening now and what is likely to happen next. All of this in a social sphere. I mean, our social lives are far more important than anything else. I mean, so our brains we are social animals. Our cousins, the chimpanzee, do all of this without text, right? We have developed text, but we do it without text as well. So we look for meaning, explanation, cause and effect, and predictability all the time. Predictability is really important. Now, much of this we do unconsciously or barely consciously and some consciously, so it's happening all the time. As I have a whole routine where I talk about walking into a Publix grocery store in Florida and what my brain is doing to navigate that. Wearing my Tilly hat, noticing a beautiful woman choosing a wine, then a couple of guys I need to avoid, and then the headlines on the paper, and the clerk, and the lineup behind me, and how should I say hello or not to anyhow. All of that's going on just in going through a grocery store. The third idea is that we as social animals, there are some fundamental interpersonal and social parameters the nature and boundaries of our relationships that our brains must organize and negotiate. At this very moment, it's my turn to talk and your turn to listen. Right? You know that intuitively, instinctively. You take in information and you see that that is what's supposed to happen. Now, in its simplest form, of course, what we need to know is this a friend or a foe or a threat, this person I'm meeting on the street? What is my role here? What is your role here? Well, I just described your role and my role. We need to, and we know this from the contextual information, not because I've stood up here and announced that I am about to speak and you are about to listen. So, and more specifically, we must, as social animals, formulate understanding of our here and now relationship in each encounter, in each context, along parameters of, now this is a bit arbitrary, but this little list of mine seems to fit mostly, along parameters of power, control, responsibility, intimacy, including sex, of course, and worth or status. Power, control, responsibility, intimacy, worth, and status. So hold on to these three ideas for a moment. Contextual information processing, a crucial part of our ability to communicate with one another, more important than text. That our brains are organizing machines. We need to detect, process, organize, and understand all the boundaries and parameters of any interpersonal and social relationship we may enter. And that includes family, friends, lovers, acquaintances, strangers, bosses, police, authorities, government, etc. So, teachers, classmates. We need to be able to take in information that allows us to organize and understand the nature along those various parameters that I just mentioned of our relationship in order to know what will happen next, what is likely to happen next, some predictability, and also to give us a sense of where we stand and sense of self. Now, my experience and the result of a survey that I actually did 2 or 3 years ago, I can't remember how long ago that was, not that scientific, but both support this idea, and that is that there are two main primary pathways to schizophrenia, or at least to the diagnosis of schizophrenia. When you get down to diagnosis, schizophrenia, schizoaffective, there could be a lot of arguments, but there seem to be two main pathways to that particular kind of psychotic illness. Two main ones, and then some fairly inexplicable stories of becoming ill with schizophrenia that are hard to make sense of. But two main pathways. Both of these pathways entail a deficit or a loss of contextual, pretextual information processing ability. So that original idea that I talked about. Both of the pathways involve a loss of that ability or a failure to develop that ability. In one group, the deficit can be traced to childhood. And it may actually reach a level of deficit that today would satisfy a diagnosis of autistic spectrum disorder or Asperger's, or sometimes not quite. But looking back and reinterpreting the social struggles with the concepts I just mentioned, we see that it was always there. That struggle to interpret contextual information was always there. In the second group, there appears to be no deficit in childhood. And then the families remember a socially successful, maybe academically successful and socially successful child preteens. And then a change in early, mid, or late teens, a loss or decay in contextual information processing starting in the adolescent years. And adolescence, of course, is the precise developmental phase in which contextual information processing, or pretextual information, is highly taxed. Simply put, all the parameters and boundaries of power, control, responsibility, intimacy, sex, self-worth, or status through adolescence must be renegotiated. I mean, this is what adolescents, well, if you've ever sat with adolescents, this is what's going on. This is these parameters of social life, relationships, which reflect on a sense of self, are being negotiated constantly and renegotiated. They must be renegotiated in the teen years from the very simple parameters of childhood. As a child, those parameters that I just discussed are very simple, except for maybe the terrible twos when they're challenged, and a couple other times they're challenged, and they're periodically challenged and negotiated or renegotiated, but they're fairly simple. Mother provides the food. I don't have to go to work. Mother and father work, etc. There's a bed I expect to have without paying the landlord. I mean, so the relationships are simple. Peer relationships as a child, sib relationships, child-parent relationships. They do go through different phases, and if the contextual information processing in childhood is deficient, then one notices problems in that social world, reaching out to other kids, rather play with the toy than move over to a peer group in the other corner of the daycare, being able to mirror affect, eyes, laugh, chuckling. I mean, it starts right from the crib. And we think that the child smiles first, the infant smiles first, and mother smiles back. The mother thinks she smiles first and the infant smiles back, but I think developmentally it's the other way around. The child has inherited that particular social communication at that point. The smile, mother smiles back, and off we go. We are now engaged in a mirror dance with one another of pretextual communication skills. The primary tool in the negotiations that I'm talking about through adolescence is, of course, contextual information exchange. Nonverbal, pretextual, not text. Now, I could say that without having to do a caveat 30 years ago. Now there's an awful lot of text being communicated back and forth, and a real mess around it. And that's because texting, that's where emojis come in. But they're not quite, your smile that you're nodding and smiling, the emoji is not quite as informative as your smile and your nodding, right? And you know, all these texting back and forth with groups of teenagers blows up periodically. Well, all right. So, before we gave them cell phones, the primary tool for that negotiation of everything I mentioned before was contextual information processing and exchange. Reading others, taking information in, mirror neurons make us smile back, our eyes do a dance. And all of those things are negotiated. I mean, none of them are negotiated through text. That very fact is, of course, the running humor in the Big Bang Theory. So Sheldon uses text to compensate for his inability to deal with contextual information. And it's the running joke through the whole series. When he talks of sex, he talks of it in a very textual fashion when he speaks of coitus and et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's not how teenagers get it together. So just as a nice example of the two things I'm talking about, it also means very clever children can compensate for a failure or disability in the contextual area with text. I end up actually with quite a few young men with ASD who, when they get to about 2022, can be fully aware of their own deficits. And because they're very clever, we can have long talks about anything and everything. They are the Sheldons in my office, whether it's nuclear physics or politics. But they don't have other relationships, but they may develop them. All right. So now, when contextual and pretextual information processing fails in adolescence, and it might have been a deficit in that area throughout childhood, but the child is bright enough, smart enough, et cetera, supported enough that it hasn't been a major deficit. Or there's been no deficit in contextual information processing until adolescence. And for some reason, and there are a number of theories about pruning that happens, that some reason at that point the contextual information processing fails or decays. When that fails and decays, and that is the tool by which we remain part of the social group. That is the tool by which we negotiate our roles. It's the tools by which we move through adolescence to adulthood. Those tools. Those are the tools by which we negotiate a new relationship with our parents over those 8-10 years. Those tools are not there, or they are deficient or decayed. The first behavior that you see when that is happening, first behaviors are usually quite understandable. It's retreat, withdrawal, avoidance, self-isolation, and restricted communication patterns. The latter is one of the curious ones because if I open up a conversation with you, I've got to be comfortable that when you look at me and I look at you, that it's going to be predictable, that I can read your face and I'll be able to say, notice you don't want to talk to me, or I'm Joe Biden and I kiss you on the back of the head, and that way I don't have to look at your face and notice. Sorry, it did occur to me. He may overstep his boundaries a little because he's doing it from the back. So he doesn't see the eyes that tell him to back off. But that's actually how we do that. It's all communicated non-verbally. All right. When we can't read that, we retreat, withdraw, we avoid, and so your teenager who was social is suddenly not social anymore. Isolates himself or herself, and there are male-female differences. And then a strange one is restricted communication patterns, but obviously the more I talk, the more I'm going to have to use skills, my contextual information skills, and if I don't have them, the safest thing I can do is not talk. I will not have to use them if I don't talk. Or if my communication is reduced to single syllables, yes, no. So I restrict communication patterns. Some of the negative symptoms are really, I think they are evidence of how profoundly we are social animals. that our facial expressions, our responses, our eye movements are all a dance between us socially. If I do live in a you'd probably find me with limited affect too if I lived in a cabin on my own for 10 years. So a lot of that is the nature of the internalization of what is happening here, which is I can't read your emotions. I don't know our relationship. I will be flat. I won't try to project any of my own. So the retreat, withdrawal, avoidance, self-isolation, restricted communication patterns protect against the terror of social confusion. High anxiety, the whole system arousal is part of anxiety. It protects, so retreating, isolating, protects against that terror or panic of being in a social situation which you cannot read. But, as I mentioned before, the brain needs to organize, develop virtual social structures and maps. Our brains do this. We look for patterns, we look for explanations, we look for cause and effect relationships. And if we can't read them in our environment and learn them in our peer group and through our teachers and peers because we can't process that kind of information, then we may start inventing them or searching elsewhere for them. So what accompanies the social isolation is often searching behavior. Searching for explanations, cause and effect explanations for what is happening around me, what is likely to happen next, who am I, where do I fit in? Now and it's really the search for meaning. When I first started to thinking about it in these terms, it was a different world. And the searching behavior I observed with young men and women who had schizophrenia or were developing schizophrenia was limited to reading often philosophy, history, religious texts, poring over religious texts. These are all night long studying the Bible, all night long studying the Bible. Which reminds me, being up at night and sleeping during the day protects you from a lot of social interaction as well. So that's a common part of the isolation, up at night, sleep through the day. This has taken on a whole new, while reading religious texts and sometimes joining cults, there are a fair number of young people developing schizophrenia who join Hare Krishna and other similar cults because they give a simplified answer to all those questions I just mentioned, that the brain must organize. They provide it for the teenager. But now there's a whole world out there in the internet that one can search all night. Forums and internet sites looking for answers to those very questions I mentioned before, providing simplistic worldviews that explain everything. But our brains continue to be organizing machines, and when they fail to be able to take in, understand, filter, and utilize real social interpersonal information, we ask other people what they think, and we listen to them. But if we can't do that, because I can't engage in that conversation with anybody, our brains still want answers, are still looking for maps and explanations. And we may develop then compensatory mechanisms. And these are often seen by families as obsessive compulsive behaviors or repetitive behaviors or childlike pursuits and restricted relationships. So now we have the 15, 16-year-old who's restricting relationship to mother and father and engaging in some repetitive task and a number of repetitive behaviors and childlike pursuits, all all in the employ of reducing the terror and the anxiety of social confusion. And these can include simplified stereotypical role, assumptions, and assignments. Family members often are on the receiving end of the assignment. My way of understanding this world is you wouldn't, my way of understanding this world is you wouldn't let me go to school. It's your fault I didn't graduate and I didn't go to school. My way of understanding this world, I don't have any friends because you don't like anybody I bring home. But you haven't brought anybody home for 2 years. Well, but that's why I don't bring them home. It's because you don't like anybody I bring home. So simplified stereotypical roles that I assign the others in my life, and they now have reduced to family members, maybe sibs, and sometimes take on a role, a simplified role, assume a role that I engage in. The most common of these are, of course, played out with the parents. And then these organizing ideas can evolve into delusional thinking. And that thinking can be fleeting and changeable depending on the level of disorganization and anxiety the person has at this moment. So they can, as I've witnessed many times, they can shift from being God to being the devil and back to God being the devil. It hasn't settled in any way, or those ideas can become fixed delusions or settled delusions. This explains everything. The brain, getting back to the other point, our brains have to do that. And our brains do tend to, without illness, of course, settle on some fairly fixed notions of how the world works. And there are many of us who do slip into a bit of conspiracy theory without having a psychotic illness or schizophrenia. I'm just giving an example. Our brains do need to organize the world around us, have a mental map of why things are happening, especially around power control, etc. That is why delusions are, in my experience, never trivial. Delusions are always about those parameters that I just mentioned. They're not trivial matters. They are always about control. Who's in control? Who's controlling me? What do I control? How much control do I have in this situation? Maybe I have none because of the microchip implanted in me. Power. Who has the power? How much power do I have? Do you have? Intimacy, self-worth, and responsibility. These are some of the symptoms, for instance, of I have spent a lot of time with a mute young man who eventually started talking, but he would write his answers to my questions, but not talk. And it was simply because if he spoke, someone would die. So this is his action. His action could have a consequence in another continent. It's a cause-effect relationship that he arrived at in a delusional fashion that satisfies the need to have that cause and effect. Or the police are after me and following me, and that explains. In all the cases of delusion, it's the symptom of the brain organizing, finding, inventing cause-effect relationships and predictabilities in those parameters mentioned before, which occasionally, of course, leads to acting on that delusion. delusions often, of course, delusions change with the times. They incorporate contemporary trends and technologies. Right at the moment, I don't see that many young people with schizophrenia, so I'm not sure exactly how many of them are dealing with what they're learning and searching on the internet for, although I certainly read about it. Once upon a time, the control problem was answered by X-rays are controlling me, or moon waves are controlling me. I'm being controlled by something out there via X-rays. Of course, it's more likely to be somebody implanted a microchip in me now that is controlling me. Nobody becomes Queen Victoria anymore, but there are other levels of grandiosity that are mentioned now. So the trends and technologies influence the actual content of the delusion, but the delusion itself is a means of answering those fundamental questions that we all must be able to answer interpersonally. We must carry templates in our head to answer the question, what is happening now to me? What is going to happen? We all need to know the answers to that, and the answers, if you have a defect in contextual information processing, the answers are gotten from other than your social group that you're interacting with daily. Those basic interpersonal parameters. Then the same explanation, but I won't try to explain other symptoms at the moment, but the same basic deficit can be used to explain a lot of other things you see with people with schizophrenia.